Don't forget to like the video, share our thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with early test stories. I never expected anything like this to happen. Not at my age, not in my marriage, not in the middle of a perfectly ordinary evening. It all started on a Friday night when my husband Mark invited a few colleagues over for dinner. It wasn't too unusual. He worked in finance, and these gatherings had become a routine part of our lives over the years. I enjoyed hosting them, though they were usually filled with stiff conversations about market trends and client portfolios. That night, I was in Theachin, putting the finishing touches on a charcuterie board when I heard them lawing in the living room. Their voice were warm, familiar. Mark's deep chuckle, friendly teasing of his younger Kurt James, and then there was Ethan. Ian had been working with Mark for over a decade, and though we'd met many times before, I never really paid much attention to him. He was professional, the kind of man who never made much of an impression. At least that's what I'd always thought, but then he said something that stopped me in my tracks. "You have no idea." Mark Ethan's voice carried from the living room, low and smooth, a little too serious for Thea lighthearted. "Banter, your wife Ash has this presence. She walks into a room, and you can't help but notice Hirsch's." I didn't hear thirst. My hands froze over the plate of crackers. I was arranging my breath caught in my throat. Did I hear that right for Asakand, I thought. I had imagined it. Maybe it was just being polite, a harmless complaint. But there was something about this tone, something that sent a strange shiver down my spine. I forced myself to move, picking up the tray and walking into the living room. My heart hammered. As I glanced at Ethan, he looked calm, swirling with whiskey in his glass, as if he had just said something that made my stomach twist. Mark oblivious laughed. "You make it sound like she's royalty or something." Ethan smiled. "Maybe she is." His eyes flicked toward mine just for a second. It was brief, very nautical. But I felt it, and that was when I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something in the air had shifted, and I had no idea what to do about it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I played the role of the perfect hostess, smiling and nodding, refilling drinks, making small talk, but the entire time I felt like I was watching myself from the outside, like I wasn't reality. Ethan didn't say anything else out offline, at least not that anyone else will notice, but I noticed everything. The way his eyes lingered a little too long when I spoke, the way he stood a little too close when he handed me an empty glass, the way his fingers brushed against mine for just a fraction of Asakand, so brief. It could have been an accident, yet deliberate enough that it left my skin tingling. I was shaken, not because of what he did, but because of how I felt. I was 46 years old. I had been married for 22 years. I had never once thought about another man in any real way, but Ethan, he had made me feel something, and I didn't know what to do with that later that night after everyone had left, and Mark was fast asleep beside me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I tried to reason with myself. It was nothing, just words. Just a harmless comment. Ethan was probably like that with everyone. Maybe he had too much to drink. Maybe I was overthinking it, but deep down, I knew better. There was a meeting there, and the worst part, I didn't hate it. I should have felt guilty, but instead I felt alive, like something inside me had woken up after years of betterment. I turned over, looking at Mark's sleeping face in the dim glow of the moonlight. I loved my husband. I realized about that night, for the first time in a long time. I felt like a woman first and a wife second, and that terrified me. The next morning, I went about my routine as if nothing had happened, as if Then's words hadn't lingered in my mind all night, as if my heart hadn't raced every time I replayed that subtle, fleeting look in his eyes. Mark was already up by the time I made it downstairs, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone at the kitchen table. He looked up when I walked in and smiled. "Morning, beautiful." I smiled back, though it felt automatic. Practiced morning. I busied myself with making coffee, but my hands weren't steady. I could still feel the ghost of Ethan Stouch, the weight of his unspoken words changing between us in a way that Mark, blissfully unaware, would never notice. "Dinner was great last night, Mark." Said James and Ethan were both raving a bootied at the mention of his name. My stomach clenched. I forced a lie claw. Well, I'm glad. Mark took another sip of his coffee. Ethan was in a good mood, wasn't he? I froze. What do you mean? Mark shrugged. I don't know. He just seemed different, more relaxed than usual, I guess. I never realized how much he likes coming over here, he said. He always enjoys talking to you. I turned away, pretending to focus on me coffee. He said that anyway, Mark continued, oblivious to my spiraling thoughts. He actually asked if you could help him with something. My pulse spiked. Help him with what? Mark chuckled. Nothing big. He just mentioned that he's hosting a charity auction for work next month and needs some help with organizing the event. Hennos, you have a good eye for that Kindoff thing. I gripped the edge of the counter, so he wants to see me again. It wasn't a direct invitation. It wasn't inappropriate. But somehow it felt like a door cracked open just enough to see if I would step through. Mark glanced up at me, waiting for an answer. I hesitated for only a moment before forcing a casual shrug. Sure. I'd love to help. And just like that, that choice was made the following week. I met Ethan at Asmal Cafe downtown to discuss the auction details. It was a public placenta thing, secretive about it, and yet I felt nervous, like I was walking into something I didn't fully understand. Darren Effin was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him. Hellocked. Different outside of work. Moreira relaxed his tie, loosened his sleeves, rolled up. He smiled when he saw me standing as I approached. Hey, he said, his voice warm. He wasn't sure you'd come. I forced a light law. Why wouldn't he? Ethan held my gaze for a moment. And Eek knew he saw right through me. We sat down and for the next 20 minutes. We talked about the event, sponsorships, venuo, option skating. Everything was professional proprio. But beneath the surface something else was brewing. It was in the way he leaned in just slightly when I spoke, the way he said my name slowly, like he was tasting it, the way his fingers tapped against coffee cup, almost absent-minded Libby, perfectly in rhythm with my own pulse. And then, as we were wrapping up, he said it, you know? Mark's a lucky man is swallowed. What do you mean? Effin tilted his head, studying me. He has, you know, every man appreciates what as the words hung between us, heavy unspoken meanings threading through. Okay? Each syllably knew I should shut this down. It off steered the conversation back to neutral ground, but I didn't. Instead, I held his gaze, my heart pounding, because for the first time in years I felt seen, and I wasn't sure I wanted to look away that night. I lay in bed, staring at ceiling. Mark slow, steady breathingly me. I should have been sleeping, should have felt comforted by the familiar rhythm of our life together, but instead my mind was tangled in the memory of Ethan's words. Not every man appreciates what he has. What did he mean by that? Was he just making conversation, or was there some ething? I turned onto my side, watching the soft rise and fall of Mark's chest. He was a good man, a hard-working man. We had built a life together. Routinek umfortical life. But when was the last time I had felt truly desired? When was the last time I had looked into my husband's eyes and seen something more than familiarity? I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. The following week, Ian and I continued working on the charity auction. We exchanged emails, texts, always professional, yet I could sense an underlying current, silent techno-ledged of something gunspoken. And then one afternoon, he escaped to meet him at the venue to finalize medals. The building was a grand historic hall with towering windows and intricate chandeliers. Ethan was already there when I arrived, leaning against one of the tables, his sleeves rolled up as he studied a seating chart. You made it, he said, smiling as I approached. Of course, I replied, keeping me tone light. This is important, he nodded, but didn't look away. It is we walked through the space discussing the logistics, where the stage would go, how guests would be seated, but the more time we spent together, the harder it became to ignore the way his presence affected me. At one point, as we stood near one of the tall windows, he turned to me suddenly. Can I ask you something? I hesitated. Sure. He studied me for a moment. Are you happy, Claire? The question hit me harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to answer instinctively, of course. I was happy I had a loving husband, a stable life, but words wouldn't come. Ethan took a step closer, his voice softer now. I see the way you hesitate, for you speak the way you laugh, but your eyes don't quite match. I see the way. You carry the weight of something you don't say out loud. I swallowed, my heart pounding. Ethan, I don't mean to cross a line, he interrupted gently, but I also pretend I don't notice for a moment. I just stood there, my breath shallow, long had it. Ben, since someone had looked at me like this, since someone had dossed. Okay? A question like that, and Rely wanted to know the answer. The airbet weenus felt charged, filled with a possibility. I wasn't sure I was ready for, and yet I didn't move away. I should have. Walked away. I should have ended the conversation right there. Laughed it off, pretended none of it mattered, but the truth was I didn't want to eat. Stood, close his presence, almost magnetic. I could feel the warmth of him's quiet intensity in his gaze. And the worst part, he wasn't wrong, was I happy used to be. I had built a life around certainty, around routine. Mark was dependable, steady. A good man, but somewhere along the way we had stopped seeing each other in the way that mattered. Our conversations had become a logistical, our affection habuel, and now standing here with Ethan, I felt something I hadn't felt in Ursulav. I took a shaky breath. Ethan, we can do this. He didn't move, he didn't push, but he also didn't look away. I know a pause stretched between us, thick with ovary thingins. Then, finally, he exhaled and gave me a small knowing smile. But it doesn't change the fact that you deserve to feel seen. Sella, his words settled deep inside me. Anashi. I didn't realize I'd been carrying 4 years. I nodded, stepping back, putting distance between us, not because I didn't feel something, but because I knew what was at stake. We should finish up. I said, my voice, barely above a whispering, held my gaze for a long moment. Be fair ending? Yeah, let's do that. That night is at across from Mark at the dinner table, watching as he scrolled absent-minded Lithrow, his phone between bites of food. Hum of the television played in the background. The same comfortable silence had lived in for years, settling when. As I thought about Ethan's words, about the way he had looked at me, like, is something worth noticing, Gand? Then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I reached across the table and placed my hand over Mark's. He looked up, startled, his icy ricking. Mine, Claire, I smiled, a real, genuine smile. I just wanted to say I miss Yowie's brow furrowed. I'm right here. I know, I whispered, but I think we forgot how to really be here. Mark studied me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, and then, first time in a long time, he set his phone aside, reached for my hand, and held it tight. Maybe happiness wasn't about grand gestures or stolen moments. With Samio knew, maybe it was a bootrum bearing to choose the person you had promised to love, over and over again. And that night I chose Mark. I chose us.